So we're going with this theme of destructive leadership, and our next speaker, Dr Vicki Webster, is an organisational psychologist who's been working in this space for some years now as a practitioner and a researcher, and more recently as the founder and director of Incisive Leaders. Vicki also is a lecturer in the Graduate Certificate in Leadership and Management at Griffith Business School, and completed her PhD research on the dark side of leadership, and most importantly, the impact on followers, which I guess is where we have a real interest as coaches. I'm interested to explore the book that Vicki has written, which is called, co-authored, How to Get Ahead Without Murdering Your Boss. 6 simple steps to actively manage your career. So if you could join me in welcoming Vicki, and perhaps we can see what we do about these destructive leadership behaviours.
In spite of all the work on leadership that assumes it by definition to be good, we exercise power, authority and influence in ways that do harm. This harm is not necessarily deliberate. It can be the result of carelessness or neglect. But this does not make it less injurious and in some cases calamitous. Destructive leadership is being defined as the systematic and repeated behaviour by a leader or manager that sabotages the effectiveness, motivation, well-being or job satisfaction of subordinates. And that can be anything on a continuum from derailed leadership. So as early as 1964, a scholar called Brown talked about executive derailment. More in the 90s, so that was more about not listening to dissenting views, avoiding solving problems, not seeking feedback, being unpredictable and volatile. In the 90s, it came more to that strengths in extreme approach. So the very conscientious expert overdone might become the controlling micromanager, or the person who's very assertive and has very firm views overdone becomes intimidating, or the harmonious person who values relationships becomes passive aggressive, won't have the difficult conversation, won't make the hard decision. So it's estimated about 60% of the management population falls within this potential to derail under certain circumstances, and those circumstances are the ones that Michael so kindly just pointed out. So thank you. Then it moves on to slightly more serious abusive supervision or toxic leadership, which is that sort of leadership that creates the walking on eggshells feeling. No one can quite predict what's going to happen next. Everyone's a bit tense, walking on eggshells. And then you get to the extreme end, the dark triad. And this is probably who we typically think of when we think of destructive leadership. However, that's only about 3%, it's estimated, of the management population. So don't rush to judge that everyone is an organisational psychopath. Having said that, I have worked for them. And so what I saw was lying as if they're breathing, and inappropriate sexual relationships. The rules didn't apply to them, getting a patron to protect them, patsies to do the work because I'll claim credit for whatever success I can get my hands on, misrepresenting their qualifications and their standing. So some quite extreme behaviour at this top end. So we do need to be able to recognise whether we're coaching or leading if we're working with a dark side, a dark triad leader, whether they're a colleague or a boss or a direct report, because how we might respond to that type of destructive leader compared to a derailing leader is quite different. So what are the consequences of destructive leadership? At an organisational level, we know that it leads to disengagement, which leads to presenteeism. I'll just come in, get my job done, get the hell out of here. Absenteeism, often absenteeism to take leave to job search, and then ultimately turnover. It costs a lot to organisations in lost productivity, but also stress claims have been increasing. So 2001 to 2011 in Australia, stress claims increased exponentially. They've leveled off a bit since then. But the issue for us is, even though they might not all have been the result of destructive leadership, we know that management support is a buffer against stress. So there's something going on there. And stress claims are much more expensive to organisations than any other sort of claim because it takes so long to get people back to work. And so an example would be one of the respondents in one of my studies had been on stress leave for 2 years. and he needed someone with him to answer the survey because he was still so traumatised by his experience. So they're very complex and they're very difficult to get people back to wellbeing from a stress claim. At the team level, lots of team conflict because there's conflict between the in-group and the out-group. Typically there's some favourites who'll do what the leader wants, so they're the in-group. Out-groups see them more clearly sooner, so they get targeted pretty quickly. Or the leader may create conflict between teams. So there's a lot of noise, a lot of conflict going on that helps the leader not be detected about some of their behaviour, that they're at the core of it. Or there's a lot of lost time while team members, and I'm guilty as charged, off at the coffee shop, you wouldn't believe what they've done now. So there's all this talk and gossip and who can outdo someone else on the more outrageous story that you can tell about the boss. But by far the most research has been on individual targets and the impact on them. So typically when a person identifies that there's something wrong with their relationship with a leader, they go into problem-focused coping first. So I'll work harder, I'll try and repair the relationship, or I'll go around them, or I'll call the behaviour. And that doesn't work so well, and that leads often to strong emotional distress. Now, the people who pick it quickly, identify it quickly, and they can escape and leave the situation, in whichever way, resign or move to another area, they don't do too badly. They get a bit of emotional and psychological distress, but overall they don't do too badly. But for those who feel they can't leave, so for whatever reason, it might be that they've got a mortgage, they can't easily get another job, or they just don't have the confidence anymore and the energy to job search, and they feel stuck in that area. That's when, over a period of psychological, emotional distress, some really weird physical stuff starts happening. So I had everything reported from impacted wisdom teeth to gastric upsets, vomiting before going to work, skin rashes that came and went, hair loss, weight loss. They go to their GP, have all the tests, they say there's nothing physically wrong with you, it's all a result of stress. So again, some fairly extreme outcomes from destructive leadership. Despite that, the most harmful outcome reported was the inaction of organisations. So that just compounded the issue. And particularly if there was a lack of consequences for the leader. So in one of my studies, 76 people who self-identified that they were working with or for a toxic leader reported that over half had no consequences whatsoever for their behaviour. Only 7 were dismissed and 11 resigned, but the rest all went on as before. And as we know, often it's the targets who leave the situation, not the manager. So another reason that I think, why don't organisations take action? So partly it might be because of employee silence, partly it might be for a whole range of other reasons. And another reason is because we're not treating destructive leadership as a wicked problem. Often organisations will treat it as a problem-solving risk management strategy rather than a wicked problem. So there's many reasons why action might not be taken. So the leader might hold power. They might have expertise that's hard to come by, or they might hold very important client relationships, or they bring the bulk of the money in, the revenue in, all sorts of reasons why their behaviour is tolerated. Or there might be structural reasons. So often HR is brought in to deal with the offending leader, and they're at a lower position in the organisation than the person that they're trying to manage. And we can guess that's not going to have a good outcome. So often I've talked to a couple of HR directors who did try and take on a badly behaved executive and they lost their jobs. So there's all these structural issues as well that's a problem. The other thing that makes it wicked is that, and hard for organisations to act, is that the behaviour that distresses one employee might be water off a duck's back to another. So this comes back again to Michael's previous talk about how we react. Which parts, some people are triggered quite easily, others, people come up and concerned of, I can't believe he spoke to you that way, and going, what? Didn't even notice. So this makes it hard as well for organisations to take action and know where the harm is actually being caused. So what makes destructive leadership a wicked problem is it can be difficult to diagnose, and you try and solve one part and it'll pop up somewhere else for whatever reason. And that's because there's 3 parts that you have to have in place for destructive leadership to flourish. So if you want it to flourish, here's how to do it. The leaders themselves have to have a predisposition already to engage in that behaviour. So they have to be either get anxious and fearful quickly when they're challenged or whatever. Then they have to have the motivation as well to engage in that behaviour. Personalised power, I win, you lose. And then they need to have the followers around them, and this is very simplified, there's many follower facts on this, but conformers who conform, you tell me what to do and I'll do it because I know the consequences are going to be horrible if I don't. Colluders who hitch their wagon to the leader and collude with them in what they want to achieve, and the bystanders who watch but don't intervene. So there needs to be a lack of voice or a lack of action around them. And then we also need to have conducive environments. And the environments that are really great for this is when there's instability and change going on. And I'm sure you've all seen examples where there's been a really strong leader brought in to shake things up, read code destructive for strong, and then we really need to get them the hell out of there when we want to rebuild the organisation because the trail of destruction goes behind them. It can be cultural norms as well. Some of our paramilitary organisations have a norm of that really tough, authoritarian leadership rather. And I've also noticed, and unfortunately there's not much research on this, that where there's a big power differential between a profession and a client, so if you think child safety, any police, corrective services, disability, mental health, for some reason when those professionals get into leadership roles, they seem to abuse that power relationship with their staff as well. So I'm not sure why that is, and certainly I still haven't seen any research on it, but I think it's interesting that it gets, I'm seeing a few nods there, it gets replicated, yeah. So 3 things that need to be in place. So an organisation can't just say, well, this is a personality clash between a manager and a staff, which is their famous get out of jail free comment. It's much more complicated than that. So how are organisations dealing with it at the moment? They're taking the complexity and applying fairly linear problem-solving solutions, and we'll look at this through the lens of stress management interventions. So primary preventions are around primary interventions around prevention, things like codes of conduct, values with underpinning behaviours, procedures and policies, sanctions for bad behaviour, etc. Most organisations, except for startups, already have this in place, and it isn't really having much impact in the context of destructive. It's important, but it doesn't stop destructive leadership. Secondary interventions around protection, leadership development, resilience, wellbeing programs for staff. In their generic form, while they can be useful in the context of destructive leadership, they really don't cut it, and I'll come back to that point. And finally, tertiary interventions after the harm has happened, after the leader has caused distress to people. And this is where things really go off the rails, because most organisations go down the legal route. And so we'll have an investigation, and then which will take months, and then we'll have a finding, and then we'll bring the parties together and try and have conflict mediation, and then there'll be a written warning or there won't. And it doesn't matter what the outcome, everyone loses, because if it's upheld, then I'm going to get you for reporting me. If it's not upheld, the employees feel no one's listened. So it's a really, how do people even begin to work together after that? And I've coached leaders off the back of having complaints lodged against them and targets, and it's just not a pretty story no matter which way you look at it. So we definitely, as organisations, or if we're coaching organisations around this, we really need to change the way we respond after harm has happened. So I'm advocating for a complexity approach to a complex issue. Instead of trying to problem solve, what do we already know? And there's a decade of literature now, so we have a fair body of information around what we know about this topic, and what don't we know, and where's the edge, and how do we nudge against that edge to find out more, and what will work in our particular organisation, culture, sector. So some recent work that's been interesting in this is Kaufman and Al down in Melbourne have come up with an antidote, if you like, to the dark triad, and they've proposed the light triad. And I'll bring my notes. So I'll just share with you some of what they've theorised here. So their argument, and I would concur, is that we need to bring more humanism back into the organisation. I don't think I'd get too much disagreement here. So humanism is valuing the dignity and worth of each individual person, Faith in humanity is believing that people are fundamentally good. And Kantianism is we treat people as a means to themselves as opposed to a means to an end. So Kantianism is the opposite of Machiavellianism. And they have a scale for this, of course. But things that they're looking at is leaders who might say, I'm quick to forgive people who have hurt me, or I tend to applaud the successes of other people, or I prefer honesty over charm, or when I talk to people, I'm rarely thinking about what I want from them. So a really different type of leadership to the, what might be in the cut and thrust of normal business. So I think this is something to think about. How do we actually start to coach and develop leaders in humanism and the light triad? And as a result of that, we might need to rethink leadership development. So many leadership programs are very much focused on leadership capability frameworks, which is fine, or behavioural frameworks, but they don't explicitly necessarily explain that there is a dark and a bright side of leadership, and that we all, every one of us, stray into the dark side of leadership when we're particularly fatigued, frustrated, excited, whatever. So explicitly explaining to leaders that there is a dark and a bright side, and what are the triggers, even some neuroscience, some of the psychology, when am I likely to trigger and behave in a way that might cause harm? If obviously training in itself isn't going to be that effective except to let people know what that research is, coaching can be very effective at that derailing abusive supervision level. Leaders with good intent who are just overdoing their strengths, coaching is fantastically effective. However, you may want to think twice about whether you want to coach a dark triad leader. They love it because they get all the techniques from the coach, and then they have even better ways to manipulate the people around them. And if you're an executive coach coaching them, they'll try and get you as well. So particularly if you try and hold up the mirror. So as coaches, we need to recognise it quickly because there is a risk to coaching those sorts of individuals. When it comes to encouraging courageous followership or encouraging employee voice, as I said before, generic resilience programs can be good, but again, we're not explicitly saying this is what good leadership looks like, this is what bad leadership looks like, and this is how to identify it early. Most people have an implicit model of what a good leader is, and it's very variable. And the main reason that there's harm off the back of destructive leadership is we just don't recognise it in time. By the time we realise what's going on, it's a bit too late. So explicitly including things like what's the bright and dark side of leadership, how do you recognise it? If you've got frustrating behaviours from a manager, how are you reacting? Are you shooting yourself in the foot by the way you respond to that leader? What's your needs and wants, and how do you have a better and more adaptive way of getting it when you're frustrated by your manager's behaviour? So explicit, and then the typical resilience exercise, mindfulness, etc., sits very nicely with that, but explicitly putting it in the context of destructive leadership. I don't know if you've heard, I was reading recently about red teams. Has anyone heard about red teams? Yeah. So I think this is particularly pertinent. Red teams are external teams that security or the military bring in to identify the thinking of the enemy and predict what the enemy will do next. So, if it's a cyber attack or if it's a terrorist. And I think as coaches or leaders, if we're leading our people, we need to be their red team. They need to know when it's safe to speak up and when they shouldn't. That this person has a different way of regulating and responding than what we do, and I need to understand how they think. Then I'll be able to predict what might be a good way forward and when it might be safe and when it may not be safe to speak up. So, but commend red teams too. The third point is really around that moving away from a legalistic approach when there's an allegation of destructive leadership or bullying. And one thing to consider is workplace conferencing. This is relatively new. It comes from restorative justice principles, but it is now being run, seeing a few nods in organisational settings. It does take a lot of work, but then I would argue so do long-term investigations and mediation processes. So the facilitator does do a lot of pre-work, interviews all the parties, then they're brought together in a circle to talk about what happened, what was the intent behind what happened, what was the impact, and how do we move forward. Now again, if you had a dark triad leader, you would not have them in the circle, you would have a representative from the organisation instead. But you can imagine that this would be a much kinder humanistic process for a leader who's just gone a bit far with one of their strengths, didn't intend to do any harm, and it could be resolved much more quickly around in a circle conversation than going through some protracted legalistic process that causes harm. So, key messages. Destructive leadership destroys people, teams and organisations, we know that. Silence allows it to flourish, and how organisations are responding to it at the moment isn't particularly effective. So the question is, how do we deal with the complexity of destructive leadership and at the same time develop light triad leadership in our organisations? And I'm very keen to share my resources if you'd like to know more about this topic. Thank you.
So Vicki, we've probably got time for a couple of questions if there's...
Thanks, Vicki. So you mentioned moving away from the legal approach that has been done to the light, which seems like a journey.
Yes.
So
yes.
what's the first few simple steps an organisation could take to move away from the legal response?
Yeah. The main thing would be to not stop rushing to investigation as soon as there's an allegation. It's very complex because often behaviours happen behind closed doors. So, very few are foolish enough to behave badly in public, or there might have been some gaslighting or whatever. But I think I hear too quickly, instead of just getting the parties together and have a talk or talking to them individually, we go straight to a formal letter or we go straight to an investigation. Is there any way we can just bring them together to have a talk about what's happened and see if it can be repaired then and there before going to the legal process? And then maybe giving both parties coaching support or whatever support. In my research, people don't go to HR and they don't go to EAP typically because they perceive that's still part of the organisation. So maybe providing some other avenue of support at the same time. Yeah, be a good start anyway.
Thank you for that. Can you please clarify some of the key differences between workplace mediation, where you do have the whole team who might actually, be part of the mediation versus the workplace conferencing? What's some of the differences there?
Yeah, so that could be an hour conversation, so I'll give you the short answer. In mediation, the facilitator has a very active role of reflecting and summarising and bringing the points to each other, and they might separate them and bring them back together. In workplace conferencing, the facilitator's role is not to have an active part, it's to have the people talk to each other. So they might help that process at the beginning. There's no reflecting, no summarising. You stay in the circle and have the conversation, and if it's successful, the facilitator fades out and the people keep talking to each other. That's the main difference.
Is there some sort of an accreditation for that different?
Yes, there is a Restorative Justice Institute, and you can join in Queensland. And Margaret Gorsburn, who's on the Sunshine Coast, is an excellent practitioner, and she works in corrective services and police.
Some schools do that very well now.
It started in schools, so Margaret took it into schools for year 12s that had gone off the rails, and pretty quickly worked out it was the leaders and the principal who needed it. And then it went from there, from school workplaces into normal. Yeah, progression.
Very quick question from my good friend Roderick.
Oh, thank you, Catherine. I feel great. Vicki, that's awesome. It's the opposite of that, where you actually have a toxic follower.
Yes.
Coaching someone at literally the dark triad in the team.
Yes.
I'm really interested in your research to come across that, and is that your next book?
Yeah, that'll be one. Yes. That's part of the complexity. It's often not the direct manager. It could be a dotted manager, it could be a colleague, could be a direct report. Yeah. And that's the other issue I find, is that when the senior managers find out there's a direct report, they palm it off as a personality clash. They won't deal with it. So yes, they're alive and well in all parts of the organisation, and even the bullying up literature and the what they call it when they all get together against someone, mobbing literature looks into that, and a bit of incivility literature touches on it, but it definitely could do with a lot more research.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vicki. If you could join me. And I guess, the question is, so what do we do? And I'm hoping our next speaker will help